I want to talk a little bit more about the video and what's been turned over and what hasn't been turned over to us. And I want to focus a little bit on South US 95. Do you recall that south of Moscow on US 95 is the path that you put in your search warrant and affidavit alleging that Bryan Kohberger left Moscow going south on US 95?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. And are you aware that one of the videos that you gave us, the coffee shop there on South 95, that leaving Moscow, you have to pass that covers 5 a.m. to 6 a.m.?
I do not recall the time frame for that.
And so the time frame in these videos would matter, right?
Certainly.
The time frame in the videos, to be meaningful, would need to cover a time that surrounds the allegations against Mr. Kohberger. Is that fair to say?
You could say that, yes.
Okay. And are you aware that Wasson-Kari Construction had a video, and that also has a very limited time frame, like 5 a.m., just 1 hour of video also?
Sounds vaguely familiar, yes.
And that's also south on Highway 95, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And the one we talked about today, Monday's machine that nobody can find, that clearly was given to Moscow Police Department, that's also south on 95.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I understand that you had a lot of help on canvassing and collecting things. There was a lot to do. But as the lead agent and the lead department, is there some kind of inventory of these videos, like a general inventory that would help me know what you have and why you don't have the relevant time frames?
The inventory that would be most useful to you is the inventory of evidence that has been booked into the Moscow Police Department. That's the inventory.
And I did come see the evidence. That's fair. I did come see the evidence. We didn't watch videos together, though, did we?
No, ma'am.
And would you agree that that evidence is on thumb drives with stickies on papers that tell us different things, but not like an inventory of what's on each thumb drive?
I am not aware of an inventory of each individual thumb drive.
Okay. So for us to do that together would take some days to inventory it all together. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And that's my best way to try to find this Monday's machine.
Sure.
And Wasson-Kari Construction.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Based on your, I guess, not as thorough as you'll do review of these records, do you have a sense as to whether these records matter to us and what we're doing to defend Mr. Kohberger?
Given the timing of these records, from what I can tell in the emails that were produced by Detective Mallory, these records were generated on the 23rd of December. It's when everything started with probable cause statements. If I had to pick a time when the wheels fell off the wagon, that's the date. There are statements and there's assumptions made in the records that will never be supported by the data. There's a lot of claims that are said in these emails, and even the name files of the records are problematic. It does not represent what it's claimed to represent.
In your experience with working with AT&T records, is it common or uncommon to have two warrants, one that relies on the content of the first in the same day?
It's not uncommon to see a small time period that produces results that would increase the desire, the need for a bigger time period of records. Seeing that entire process happen twice in the same day is extremely rare.
No, ma'am. I did view a draft report from Special Agent Balance to help me conceptualize this, but it did not look like this, ma'am.
Where's that draft report?
It is, best of my knowledge, it's already been provided to the prosecutor's office through the FBI channels.
Is this the lengthy past draft report, or is it a different draft report?
Well, it would have to be the draft cast report. That's the only cast report I'm aware of from Special Agent Balance.
So on December 23rd, Are you saying you looked at this past draft report to make that map that went into your affidavit to get the second set of records?
Yes, ma'am.
The one that was given to us in July of last year?
I don't know when you got it.
How many we have the same call detail records that Nick Valance used to create his draft report?
Yes, well, I believe so.
Do those records appear to come from the December 23rd, 2022 to AT&T warrants?
I would say primarily the second warrant from what I've reviewed.
And is that because the CAST draft report spans the full 6 months of those records?
That is correct.
Okay. And those records, did those come from the second AT&T search warrant?
That is also correct.
I want to know when you first saw drive testing data that was produced to us in Discovery. What did that cover?
I found a file in the Discovery, I want to say early December, that included drive test, but it was about a 3-minute sample that covered less than a quarter of a mile in a completely irrelevant location. So it added no value to my analysis at all.
What were you looking for? What time frame and location were you looking for based on the CAST draft report review?
I would expect significant drive testing around any location that coverage maps were being used in the CAS report. I would expect significant documentation on potential routes that this device may have taken. I would expect significant documentation on the crime scene.
You just told us that you think we have most of it, but there's some significant parts that are missing.
Yeah, and I want to qualify that just so it's really clear, because I understand it's starting to get very technical. There's over 500,000 lines of data that was turned over. So I'll make it clear, there's a lot of data that has been produced. I would say, in my opinion, looking at what's been produced, probably 2 or 3% is missing. But it's not the amount of data or the time of the data, it's the locations of the data. Some of the most significant locations in this case we're missing some data.
Those significant locations, have they been depicted or captured on the CAST draft report?
They have.
And tell me what those locations are. What are we missing?
I am unable to find any measurements along, I believe it's 270, the Moscow-Pullman Road. If you drove the most direct route from Pullman to Moscow or vice versa, pretty much as soon as you're leaving Pullman to the time that you arrive in Moscow, we are missing that entire stretch. And if there's ever been a case that we need to look at, what does it look like when a phone travels from Pullman to Moscow? This is probably the case. We have the neighborhood around the crime scene, but we don't have the crime scene. From what I have reviewed, the FBI mapped 6% of the data that came in. Mallory's testimony and what I've seen through here, he was up to about 18%. So by either standard, more than 80% on both accounts were never mapped or accounted for. And I'm not talking overall from every single day for 6 months. I'm talking about the time frames that are chosen. So for example, this time period that's represented here is where I'm getting the 18%.
And that's the 48 hours?
This is specifically from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on the morning of the 13th, arguably the most critical time period of this entire investigation. They mapped a handful of connections. When I say a handful, they mapped 18%. When you add the other 82%, it tells a much more detailed story. When we put the drive test data on top of that, you can get even more refined.
The video tape that they've relied a lot on in their probable cause affidavit that we've received different parts of. Part of the hearing on the 14th is to talk about the different parts of that video that we've received and how we need the whole context. This is the video that they say places this car near the residence. We've received little tiny pieces of that. And we think Bryan's right to a fair trial means the public needs to know that they've withheld the audio from a great portion of that, and that it starts a long time before the little clip that we've received. Have you looked at this record, the 48-hour AT&T search warrant record, the return on that?
I have.
Did that include the regional tower list?
It did not.
Okay. So if you are doing this analysis, you put CDR records into a computer program, you put a regional tower list into the computer program, what does it produce?
The CDRs would show me cell sites that the phone connected to. In this case, even within 48 hours, there's hundreds of those cell sites. So it would take a while to really look at that. The regional cell site list would show me the cell towers that the phone's not interacting with, which can be just as important.
Does it spit out product to you, or does it create something that you can reference to write your next warrant?
Depending on which mapping platform you're using, they all create some type of a map that the person doing the analysis on can interact with, and they can change things, they can save things, they can create work product. Depending on that platform, that's saved in different types of maps, but yes, all of them would have some type of a mapping platform.
Okay. Would that be consistent with this past draft that we heard about earlier?
It's my opinion that Corporal Payne probably is misusing some terms there. I don't see any possibility of the FBI CAS team producing a CAS draft report on the 23rd. I think he's probably mistaken that he saw some type of CAS work product, which would be this map, before they export all those results into a report. So I believe that he probably saw some mapping through a mapping platform. It would really surprise me if there was a physical report. It would be completely out of character.
To ask itself why. And the court should ask itself, what is the state trying to hide here? The things that we're seeking in these motions to compel are things that are outlined in the probable cause affidavit. Have you looked at two separate AT&T warrant returns from December 23rd, 2022?
I have.
In your experience with working with AT&T records, is it common or uncommon to have two warrants, one that relies on the content of the first in the same day?
It's not uncommon to see a small time period that produces results that would increase the desire or the need for a bigger time period of records. Seeing that entire process happen twice in the same day is extremely rare.
The first AT&T record, we called it today the 48-hour AT&T record of Bryan's call detail record. If you were to take that and do an analysis on the call detail record, how long would that be?
Depends on the analysis. So I'll qualify that answer with looking at what was put into the second warrant that shows us at least parts of that analysis to include a route that was identified. To do it reliably and feel comfortable that I'm accurate, 3 hours, and that's if you know what you're doing and you have all the tools at your disposal. Arguably, you could spend half a day or more doing that very easily.
To do that, do you just take these records, printed copy, and know what's on there, or do you have to do something with those records?
You would have to use some type of a mapping software, and you would take the digital copy, which is typically a text file, you would import it into that program, which would then map everything. But if I'm going to use those results, search warrant affidavit, for example, there's a process that I'm going to go through to confirm the accuracy, because in theory, if I'm wrong, the entire linchpin of that case is now hinged on this affidavit that I wrote. So before I commit to swearing out to an affidavit, hey, this is what the phone is doing, X, Y, and Z, there's a further process of just mapping it to validate it. In this case, there's a lot of time distance measurements that need to be performed that can be extremely time consuming. There's some ulterior issues that come up with how that phone is interacting with other cell sites that needs to be analyzed. Again, saying that a very qualified, competent investigator spending half a day just coming up with that basic summary is very reasonable.
In that half a day, you would put that record into a computer program and a map would be produced.
Correct.
What other information besides that call detail record would you need to do this analysis?
In this case, I would want the call detail records. I would want the locabor. It's LOCABR. And I would want the regional cell tower list from AT&T.
Does AT&T generally provide that regional cell tower list inside of its record that it produces pursuant to the search warrant?
No, I would actually say by policy, they do not. It's a very large file that typically does not transmit very well to government email. So they would direct users of where they could go online and download it. The problem's the problem, not what the data helps or hurts.
The content of the data, though, is it helpful to us in representing Mr. Kohberger?
It absolutely is helpful. Everything that I've seen to date is concerning to me because it's exculpatory. I had a concern since the very first day I saw the CAS draft report that there are significant errors in the drive testing. It was before I even saw the drive testing. I can look at the coverage areas and I can tell you they're wrong. So yes, it's not a concern that they're wrong. People make mistakes. We can fix things. It's a concern that I still don't have the source data that any expert, not just myself, but anybody could sit down and look at and say, okay, I see what's happening here. Here's how we fix this. Unfortunately, that mistake has a ripple effect, and I'm seeing multiple errors that are happening as a result. So that's why this data is important, is we've reached a point that we need to determine, is this just human error? Is this accidental? Is it intentional? Is there other things at play here that's changing this narrative to where there's clearly some manipulation of the original data?
The state is getting, and we are desperate to find out the timeline in this case and when the state knew what and when. There's no question that motions to suppress are coming. Motions to suppress are coming on warrants. And whether or not those motions to suppress are based on Frank's material because misrepresentations are made depends on the timeline. So if there's a representation made in a warrant that things happened in a certain way, if we are able to look at the timeline and say, we know that the state knew this when, that gives us an answer on whether or not the suppression issue includes a truthful statement in the affidavit.